The original name of Saint Patrick was Succart, which is said to signify strong in war. Patricius appears to have been his Roman name. He was born at some period between Anno Domini 372 and 415. His birthplace was a spot which in all probability may be identified with the modern Kirkpatrick, between Dumbarton and Glasgow. The parents of Succart were Christians, and it would seem that the gospel had been preached to some extent in the neighborhood of his father's home. Whatever amount of instruction he may have received was rudely interrupted when he was about 16 years of age. The coasts of Scotland were at this time exposed to the frequent incursions of Irish chieftains, who landed from their swift barks, ravaged the country, and having carried off as many of the inhabitants as they could, consigned them to slavery. In one of these expeditions, Succart, with 2 of his sisters and many of his countrymen, was carried away and conveyed to the north of Ireland. Here he was purchased as a slave by Michul or Milchu, a chief of North Dolorodia, who dwelt in the valley of the Braid, near Mount Sleamish, in the country of Antrim. The work assigned him was that of attending his master's flocks and herds, and in his confession, which he wrote toward the close of his life, he describes how he wandered over the bleak mountains, often drenched with the rains, and numbed with the frosts. His period of servitude lasted 6 years, and during this time he would seem to have made himself acquainted with the language of the native tribes, and to have learned their habits and modes of life. At length he succeeded in effecting his escape to the seaside, where he took ship, and, after a tempestuous passage, regained his father's house. His stay, however, was destined to be very short. In a predatory excursion he was a second time taken captive, and again, after a brief interval, succeeded in making his escape. Had he listened to his parents, he would now have remained with them, but he was bent on a very different occupation. During the weary hours of his captivity, he had often reflected how blessed a thing it would be if he, to whom it had been given to know the true God and his Son Jesus Christ, could carry the glad tidings to his master's people and the land of his exile. One night, he tells us, he had a dream, in which he thought he saw a man coming from Ireland with a number of letters. One of these he gave him to read, and in the beginning occurred the words, "The voice of the Irish." While he was reading it, he thought he heard a voice calling to him across the western sea, "We entreat thee, holy youth, to come and walk among us." Obedient to what he deemed to be a plain leading from heaven, and resisting the arguments and entreaties of relatives and friends, who mocked at his enthusiastic resolve, he set out for the monasteries in southern France, there to prepare himself for the work of preaching the gospel in the land of his captivity. Amidst the conflicting legends which now follow him at every step, it seems probable that he repaired to the monastic schools of Tours, Auxerre, and Lérins, where he studied and was employed for some little time in pastoral duties, having been ordained successively deacon and priest. There he would seem to have been elevated to the episcopate, and thence with a band of fellow labourers he set sail for Ireland, about the middle of the 5th century. Landing on one of the islands off the coast of Dublin, he and his companions tried unsuccessfully to obtain provisions, which they greatly needed. Thence sailing northward they put in at a strait called Brunei, and after landing at the southwestern extremity of Strangford Loch, advanced some considerable way into the interior. They had not gone far before they encountered a native chief named Daiku, at the head of a band of men. Mistaking St. Patrick for the leader of one of the many pirate crews which at that time often appeared upon the coast, he was on the point of putting him to death. But struck by the missionary's appearance, and seeing that both he and his companions were unarmed, he hospitably received them into his house. In frequent interviews he now heard the doctrines of the faith, and after a time was baptized, with all his family. According to some authorities he also bestowed upon his instructor the ground whereon his barn was built, and here arose the celebrated church called Saul Patraic, the barn of Patrick, which still retains the name of Saville, or Saul, and is situated about 2 miles northeast of Downpatrick. Leaving Saul, the missionaries proceeded to northern Dolorodia, and the residence of St. Patrick's old master, Milchu. But nothing would induce the old chief to receive one who had once been his slave, or to forsake the paganism of his forefathers. Patrick determined to visit the central parts of the island, and especially the famous hill of Tara, where King Lear was about to hold a great religious festival in the presence of all of his tributary chieftains, druids, and bards. In this stronghold of Druidism he resolved to celebrate the approaching festival of Easter, and preach the word to the assembled chiefs. It was Easter Eve when he reached the neighborhood of Tara, and having erected a tent, he made preparations for spending the night with his companions, and kindled a fire for the purpose of preparing food. As the smoke curled upward in the evening air, it was observed by the Druids in the king's tents and caused the greatest consternation. To kindle any fire during the solemn assembly of the chiefs, before the king had lighted the sacred flame in the palace of Tara, was a sin of the greatest enormity, and the Druids did not scruple to warn the king that if the fire of the stranger was not extinguished that night, unto him whose fire it was, would belong the sovereignty of Ireland forever. Messengers were accordingly sent to discover the authors of the sacrilege, and to order them to appear before Lear. The missionaries went, and their fearlessness when in the presence of the monarch and his nobles won for them a respectful hearing. On the following day St. Patrick again addressed the chiefs, doubtless in their own language, and proclaimed to them the doctrines of the faith. Lear himself, indeed, did not profess to be a convert, but he gave permission to the man of God to preach the word, on condition that he did not disturb the peace of the kingdom. To the worshippers of the powers of nature, and especially the sun and other heavenly bodies, St. Patrick proclaimed that the great luminary, which ruled the day had no self-originated existence, but was created by one whom he taught them to call God the Father. Those who believe in him, will rise again in the glory of the true Son, that is, in the glory of Jesus Christ, being by redemption sons of God and joint heirs of the Christ, of whom, and by whom, and to whom, are all things, for the true Son, Jesus Christ, will never wane nor set, nor will any perish who do his will, but they shall live forever, even as he liveth forever with God the Father Almighty, and the Holy Spirit, world without end. Such, as it would seem from his confession, was the gospel he proclaimed, and his words, confirmed and illustrated by his own intrepid zeal, ardent love, and sincere and devoted life, made a deep impression on the minds of the Celtic chiefs. With the religious enthusiasm deeply seated in the primitive Celtic character, their hearts were touched and they welcomed the missionary, and believed the word which he preached. It was while he was staying at Saul in 466 that the Apostle of Ireland was seized with his last illness. He had lived to a good old age, and the sunset of his life was calm and peaceful. He and his fellow laborers had made for themselves, by the efforts of their own hands, civilized dwellings amid the tangled forest and the dreary morass. At a time when clan-feuds and bloodshed were rife, and princes rose and fell, and all was stormy and changeful, they had covered the islands with monastic schools, where the scriptures were studied, books collected and read, and knowledge preserved.